Welcome to the Hazard Class Podcast. This is the podcast where I ask my stupid questions to some of the smartest people in and around the world of emergency services. Today's guest is a former Atlanta paramedic, journalist, and television writer whose career spans from the front lines of emergency medicine through the pages of multiple award-winning books. You might know him from 1,000 Naked Strangers, a raw and vivid memoir of a life as a paramedic, or American Sirens, where he covers the untold story of Black pioneers who became America's first paramedics. His latest book, No One's Coming, takes readers inside high-stakes international rescue flights during the 2014 Ebola outbreak, where split-second decisions determined life or death. Please welcome Kevin Hazzard. Kevin, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, man, good to be here.
Yeah, it's I appreciate you coming. I was fortunate enough to get a copy of the book. I read it, and the book is awesome. It was literally like I can't put it down. Like I'm interested to learn about your process and how you craft it, because it reads like a novel, like in terms of like it's like twists and turns and what's next kind of thing, but it's a true story, which is like kind of like the perfect junction, right? It'd be easy to sometimes maybe write nonfiction and have it read like a textbook because it's just reporting the news, but you manage to capture the narrative and in a novel form where it is kind of a hard book to put down once you start going. So congrats on that. You were able to tell a true story in the way that it almost feels like it's not true, which is pretty impressive,
Oh, thanks, man. Thank you. I mean, look, I'm a fan of Argo. I'm a fan of The Perfect Storm, all those kinds of stories. I love that kind of stuff. I love those like adventure stories, those rescue stories. Obviously the whole medicine thing, I've been working in that for a while, but it's always about the people. Like, what do you care about? What is it you want to, any story that you tell, like it gets funnier, it gets more dramatic, it gets more whatever it is supposed to be when you know the people, when you have some sense of like who's involved and, because that's ultimately like what the stakes are, and so for me, the big thing was it is always like, who are these people? Are they interesting? Are they fun to watch? Are you going to enjoy spending a bunch of time with them? And then from there, it's just like, what is this great story that, this crazy adventure these people are on? And in this one, as you said, it was like at every moment that I needed the story to take a very specific turn because we had been going down one road too long, or because like it just like dramatically things needed to heighten. Reality provided the perfect answer to that. And it just kept happening. And I was kind of shocked. I mean, over and over, I would call somebody and say, hey, this thing that happened, what were you doing on this day? Or once this happened, what was the next step? And inevitably, it would be some crazy friggin' thing that you were like, no way. There's no way that's true. But it was. I mean, it's the most dramatic story that I've ever encountered, in terms of things that I've written or looked into. I mean, it's truly, it's insane. It's an insane story.
And the format you choose to tell it in, which I thought was really interesting, is like, I can't remember off the top of my head, but what's like 70 chapters. It's broken down into these like almost like bite-sized clumps. And then you're bouncing from this character to this character to this. It's like, I've never read the Game of Thrones book, but I've heard the Game of Thrones books are very similar to this in terms of like, hey, we follow this guy for a while, and then all of a sudden we leave him and then join this guy, and then we follow this guy for a while, and then all of a sudden these, stories that seem divergent converge, and it just, captivates you because you're like, wait. By the time you come back to some of these stories, you're like, oh man, I forgot that this guy was doing that thing. And it really is like a captivating way to take it. So as you were figuring out that formula, how did you land on the idea of all these, like, maybe there's something in literature that this is an established practice, but I hadn't read a book like that before, where it's like almost these micro stories that like stack on one another and weave to make this giant narrative. But what was that like, deciding to tell the story in that way?
Well, first, the main thing was this story had to have velocity. I mean, this is a phone call comes in saying there are some people who are about to die very far away. Getting to them is going to be insanely dangerous and difficult and controversial. You might not be able to pull it off. They might not survive. Go. You can't tell that story in a plodding, slow fashion. That's like if I tell you that's the setup, and then you enter into the book, and I'm like, bleep, bleep, bleep. Like you can be like, no, dude, no, like let's go. And so the book, I knew the book had to have that momentum and needed to grab you and just like, and that was it. And then the other thing that comes from that is like, okay, so how do we get people to get 200 pages in and still feel like they were on page one? Because I wanted this to be a book that you picked up and couldn't put down. Like that was the number one goal. I wanted it to feel like a roller coaster. And you know, for me, the way you do that is let's move really quickly. Let's make it so that you read 2 pages of this chapter, and then you enter something new, and you maybe have to get up, you maybe want to go to bed or whatever, and you go, yeah, but the next chapter is only a page and a half. Oh, let me just finish that. And all of a sudden you've gotten 70 pages in. And that was really, like, that was so much of it. It was like, I want the story to move quickly. I want the format to move quickly. And also, these things are all happening simultaneously. You know, you can't tell the story of this kind of rescue with all these people on multiple different continents, even within one continent, multiple different cities, planes coming and going. You know, you can't tell that like long stretches, because while one person is doing this, simultaneously to that, somebody else is doing something else. And these things are all of a piece. You know, it is this big puzzle that's coming together. And so it just kind of like, that was the natural way to tell it, was like, let's just keep showing you what's happening here and here and here and here, because, you know, luckily everybody's drama is heightening constantly. Like there is no end to how often the dial gets turned up, and you know, the temperature just gets a little bit hotter under these people. And I was excited to go back. I was like, hey, what are they up to? What are they up to? You know?
Yeah. So the other thing that and this is a technical writing question maybe, but as you read it, there's dialogue and there's narrative that are like specific, like you're looking over the shoulder of someone in that moment. How on earth does an author who is telling a true story craft those dialogue moments and stuff like that? Is it you're taking these interviews and kind of melding those together, or how do you get to those, like the words spoken?
A couple. If you read a nonfiction book, they're often put in quotes. You know, it'll be like, yeah, I was on the Hazzard class podcast, and we started out like this, and the guy made this joke, and he had this mustache. Well, you can put all that in quotes, which to me always feels really dry, because it takes you out of the story. It's like somebody from the future reflecting back on something that happened in the moment. So, you know, I record all my interviews, so I know what people are saying. I know exactly what comes out of their mouth during the interview. And so I'll say, like, you know, when you were trying to figure out how to do the PPE, what was that like? Who had the most trouble, and why did they have trouble? And, you know, so I get really specific about an individual moment. And then I'll just say, describe it to me. And what did you say to them? And then they'll say, well, I said this. So rather than putting that in quotes, you know, if this is a conversation, like that can then become dialogue. And then I'll call the person they were talking to, and I'll say, hey, do you remember when he said this to you? And sometimes they'll say, you know, I really don't. In which case, like, I try not to use that, because, you know, people's memories can be kind of fuzzy. But if the person's like, hell yeah, man, and then I said this back, and then, you know, so then you call the other person, and now you have this conversation, these two guys that are remembering this moment, and they're living in it, and they're telling you exactly what happened. And if you just keep going back and keep saying, like, okay, so I know you guys were in a hangar, and you can look up, you know, the beauties, you can look up the weather, you know, and I say it's 90 degrees. Like, what was it like as it's 90 degrees in Georgia and you're in a rubber suit? Like, tell me about that. And then they'll start getting into that. So then you're like, now you're in the person's head. So now I can write with certainty what was going through their mind in that moment. You know, like, how did it feel? Like, you must have been sweating your ass off. What was that like? And then they'll say, oh God, and then this and that. And then they just remember. And so I just keep digging into those details. I ask them very specifically, like, what did you say? What did you hear somebody else say? What do you got? And if they don't remember, then I'll say, well, what do you guys normally talk about in this moment? And then that can just be the narrative. That can be because if like you've done enough, you've worked in emergency medicine long enough, you've done this kind of thing long enough, somebody could ask you, generally speaking, when you were talking to this person, when you were running this call, what was that like? And even if you don't remember the minute specifics, you're going to remember the general stuff. And so we can get into your head that way. And anything you do remember specifically, rather than just putting that in quotes in the middle of a paragraph, which again, I always felt dry. If you dig into that a little bit and then you say like, hey, how, basically what I'm asking is like, how do I turn this into dialogue? What was really the conversation? People will kind of go into it. And then, I think it lays it out in such a way that you really feel like you're with that person. You're understanding what's going through their mind in that moment.
Yeah. So, I mean, so much of the book is written from that perspective that it's so interesting to hear how you got to that point, which is it's almost like, wait, is this like an autobiography? Like how you're so deeply entwined with the characters as they move that you feel like you're getting a first person perspective into their moment, them in their moment to moment, journey. So you got into it a little bit, but I'd love to hear you expand more on the process of those interviews of like, how do you decide what to get granular in? How do you decide what to view from a 10,000 foot view? Do you have like a formula, or is it kind of a riding the wave situation?
Well, that's a good question. It's to a certain degree, it is feel. If you go into, like, my style is, when you're reading one of my books, I want you to feel like you're sitting on a bar stool next to me, and we're on our third high life, and it's like, and I'm telling you this crazy story of this dude who lives down the road from me, and he did this wild ass thing. Like, I want the book to feel that way. So, but we all know how to tell a story. If you understand stories, you kind of have a certain sense of what is important and what is going to, like, what interests you and what drives you. So that's one. It's just like the natural human sort of storytelling thing. But the other is, I'll call someone once and I'll do the first interview, and it's always bland. I always walk away from the first round of interviews and go, man, there might not be a story here. It's always like, yeah, we did this thing and then this thing happened and we came back and it's no big deal. But as you talk to people, one person will let something slip. They will acknowledge that there was a mistake, or there was confusion, or there was a hiccup or difficulty. And then you start calling someone and they say, hey, I just talked to Steve, and Steve said you guys had a lot of trouble doing this. And it's almost like they're now given permission to say, oh, you're right. So then, you kind of see what for them was interesting or difficult or complicated. And then I bear down into that, because usually that's where the story lies. I didn't want, with this book in particular, I didn't want too much of it to be like, the sort of God voice of being like, Ebola is this, and this is what happens. Yeah. Because the people who were doing this didn't know Ebola. Mm-hmm. So, it's like, how did you learn that Ebola does this to you? How did you, and so I really wanted to put everything you learn about Ebola as much as possible through the experience of these people who are, Linda Mabula, the doctor on the ground in Africa, didn't know Ebola when she got there. Doug Olson, the doctor on the plane, did not know Ebola when he got there. Jonathan Jackson, nurse on the plane, did not know Ebola when he got there. Like, what did you guys know? How did you learn it? How did you learn how to protect yourselves? Well, we practiced and we did this and we did that. And so I tried my best to keep those things as personal as possible, because, I find it more interesting that way to know, how did this particular person get into this particular situation? And once they were in it, what did they do to get themselves out of it? I find that much more interesting than a generic question of this is what this thing looks like. So, it's just so much of it is feel. What are the important details? But really, what did the people who were there tell you was important? What did they feel in that moment? What was really emotional for them? Because that's what's going to be emotional for the reader too. Mm-hmm.
So this is probably the most standard, book promotional question, but I have to ask because I'm genuinely intrigued. What's your introduction to this storyline? What is the thing that you're doing in your life that says, I think I should write a book about this story? Or how do you discover it, not only personally, but as a writer that then wants to take it on as a project?
Couple things. I met Dent Thompson, who is one of the two brothers who owns Phoenix Air, in 2017. He had someone gave him a copy of Strangers. He read it and reached out to me and said, hey, I read your book. In the 70s, I worked on an ambulance in the summer. So it really resonated with me. And we kind of, it was like a pen pal situation, where he sends this email and he's like, by the way, I own this crazy company and we do these crazy things. So once I looked into what Phoenix Air was, I was like, oh, this guy is interesting as hell, and we just became, in the way that when you meet somebody interesting, you want to know more about them. Mm-hmm. We got to know one another because I'd written this book that he was interested in and he lived in this world that I was interested in. So we just kind of clicked a little bit. We moved to Atlanta at the end of the pandemic, and I said to him, hey, man, we're living here now. What do you think about me coming out to visit? I kind of wanted to see this, the airstrips and the hangars and the jets and, the people who do these crazy missions. And he said, yeah, come on out. So I get there and they're walking me through everything and I'm seeing, all the equipment and again, the jets and it's cool. Who doesn't want to walk around, jets and, mm-hmm. Aircraft engineers who are modifying planes and, the doctors who do all this stuff. So I was aware that they had been involved in the Ebola transports. So I knew that these guys that they were crazy, that they did some really crazy ass stuff, and that they had interesting stories. So I knew that I had a general idea that there's interesting things here. But while I'm on that visit, one of the pilots sort of, Dent says casually oh, yeah, this is Darren. He was on the second Ebola flight. And I turned to him and he goes, man, crazy story. He's like, when my family found out that I was going to be on this Ebola flight, my mom was so scared that I was going to die that she throws this Last Supper for me, and tells the whole family, hey, Darren might die tomorrow. You guys are all coming over here and we're all going to have dinner together. Just in case he's dead, we're going to have one final dinner. And that right there, I was like, wait a minute, your family threw you a Last Supper? And he's like, yeah, they all came, my mom, my dad, aunts, uncles, cousins, my sister, everybody's there but me. Because I got this call from a girl that I've been trying forever to get to go out with me and failing, by the way. She heard I was going to die. She calls me and gives me this hey, if you're going to die, we might as well finally go on that one date. And he's like, and I can't miss this opportunity. So I was the only one in my family who didn't show up to my Last Supper. That's the funniest, most relatable thing in the world. A dude, maybe he's going to die tomorrow. Maybe he's going to give the entire world Ebola, but he's got one shot at a girl that he's liked for a long time and he's going to take it. Yeah. I was funny. I love it. All the stakes, all the drama, all the madness, great. But now there's also humor and eccentric people in it. I'm in. So that was kind of the moment where I knew this was my sort of story.
And so from that point, obviously I don't even know, you might have a number in your head, but I can't even track it. The amount of characters in the book, there's so many people with so many different storylines. How do you go from that point, knowing Darren's story, to beginning to conduct interviews and compiling this story in totality?
Yeah. There's, people have read The Hot Zone. People have read other sort of books like this. I didn't. So I was like, okay, I don't want to focus a lot on the patients. I want this to be about because my question is if I tell you that there are 3 countries that are overwhelmed with Ebola, their governments are collapsing, their healthcare system no longer exists, there's violence in the streets, nobody will allow anybody from there out of there, and certainly nobody wants to go into there. But these 4 people are about to fly in. My first question would be who are those 4 people? And why the hell are they doing this? So I knew I wanted to focus on the providers because I thought, man, the psychology behind agreeing to do this is so fascinating. Anybody who works this job and, you tell someone you were a paramedic and they're always oh, I could never do that. And, so most people they hear it and they just think, nope. And that's just being a paramedic. That's not, being a paramedic flying into Ebola. Yeah. So who wants to go to the apocalypse? So I knew all right, let me just who are the pilots? Who are the doctors? Who are the nurses? Who are the engineers that made the technology possible? who is on the ground in Africa treating these people, waiting for their rescue. Like how, like, the people who got sick, they were doctors, they were medical volunteers. Like how did they get there, and who was working around them, and who was trying to keep them safe? Who was treating, Liberians as this was going down, as the government was trying to figure out how to make this happen? Who was on the ground treating people? So I just sort of in my head, exactly the way I did right there, laid out like, okay, these are probably my characters. And then you just kind of start to figure out like who's essential, like, oh, they'll probably get taken to a hospital. Who's the doctor waiting to receive these people? And how did that person get in that position? And what did it look like there? And then people start to tell you get certain ideas in your head about where a story's probably going to go. But as people begin to tell you their story, left turns pop in, surprises pop in, and then you go, oh, well, let's follow that for a little while. Like I didn't anticipate how much pushback they got. The bomb threats, the state of Maine threatening felony charges and anybody involved, the FBI having to get involved to protect the ambulance, the protesters at the hospital, that I wasn't prepared for. So those things come in and sort of help you to shape the narrative. But in the beginning, it's just like, what is the story I specifically want to tell? Okay, I want to tell why on earth somebody would do this. Okay, so then let's focus on who did it.
Mm-hmm. Did you find any resistance in, contacting and interviewing any of these people? Was it a process to convince them to come on board?
No, not so much. I find that generally speaking, if you come to people honestly and say, hey, look, this is who I am. This is the story I'm willing to tell. I want to tell. Are you willing to talk to me? Generally speaking, people will be like, oh, yeah, so this was this thing that I did, and let me tell you about it. But you have to be willing to keep coming back to them because you've got to build up some trust. And, one, you need to arrive having done your research so they know that you're serious and that, you can't ask them a stupid question. I have had sources in books that became important sources that the first time I talked to them, they hung up on me because I didn't have enough. I came to them poorly and, it was basically like, dude, don't waste my time. Like come back when you have some sense of what you should be asking. So that's step one. What do you need to know? Come into it, with an education and smartly. But then, take your time. I never ask super personal questions the first time. Some people will just like unload, and from day one, they're telling you all their stuff. But a lot of people, that you kind of have to get to know them a little bit and prove that you can pull this off. And so, a lot of the really good stuff comes from the third interview. Or the fourth, sometimes the first, but a lot of times what it is just you reach out to someone, they give you some version of their story, you begin reaching out to other people, and then you make your second round, and now they've seen all the people you've talked to and how much you have an understanding of this, and I think generally speaking, people appreciate the work you're putting in and the care that you're taking, and that's when they begin to really open up.
So what's the timeline of a process like this? I mean, you're talking about multiple rounds of interviews with, dozens of people, and then connecting all those dots, having all those follow-up questions as well, then actually writing the book after the interview process. Like, how long does it take to write a book like this?
With this one, the writing was really fast. Honestly, it was like a few months. The bigger thing was figuring out, like kind of as you hinted at the beginning, like how do you lay this out in a way that it doesn't feel like it's slowing down at some point, because there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of people. And so like ultimately, like who do I not include? We've all read a book where you get to, page 200 of 280. And there's suddenly like a whole host of new characters, and you're like, well, wait a minute, man, we're almost to the end. Like, who are these guys? And do I really need to know them? As I introduce new people, I wanted to be really careful about who I introduced, and then depending on how important they were, how much time I spent introducing them. Some people, they play a minor role. So like, let's, 2 sentences to give you who they are, and then we're into it. But that's a lot of the beginning. Like, you get a story, you get some people, you get a sense of how big it can be and how good it can be. And then from there, I'll write my pitch that I give to the publisher, like sort of my book proposal. And then once they say, yep, all right, go for it. Then I begin saying, okay, like, let's really talk to people. And after I've interviewed a lot of people, then I sit down and kind of start to, not in like a granular way necessarily, but in a large way, like, let's outline what this looks like. Like, what are the pieces? And I have this big whiteboard that I write things on, and I'm like, okay, there's this storyline, and there's this storyline, and there's this storyline. You got to figure out how to feather them. But oftentimes I find that is natural. Like, there is a moment in any story where you're ready to say, what's happening over there? And I just kind of write until I get to those moments, and I'm like, oh, we haven't heard from this person in a while, and what they're doing is kind of important to what's going to happen next. So, like, let's get back into their story. So, it's that's a hard part, is laying it all out, kind of having some sense in your head of where you're going to go.
So in terms of actual like time, like you said, you recorded all your interviews. Mm-hmm. How many hours of recording are we talking to compile into this book?
What's even worse is not the hours of recording, but the hours of then transcribing those recordings. Because if it's a 40-minute conversation, it's going to take you like an hour to type it out, because you're going to have to pause it sometimes, because there are some people who talk really quickly, and you got to hit pause to make sure you're getting what they're saying correctly. So if each interview, let's just say, is conservatively an hour, but most of them are about 2 hours, and you might talk to that one person 4 times. So that's 8 hours with one person that and those interviews have to be transcribed. Mm-hmm. So it's even longer for there. So, I mean, it's like a 2-year process.
Wow.
Of like, from the moment you get into it until that book is turned in, it's a lot. Like, there's, and this one was less research than I required for American Sirens, because so many people in Sirens were dead. That sort of took place in the 60s and 70s. There were a lot of people weren't there. So that was like digging through newspaper archives and, flying around the country to like visit actual archives and like, try to pull up people's stories and assemble it there. This was more, I could sit, in my office and just like call people. And that was a big part of it, was firsthand accounts, which was, really helpful. But it's a couple of years, man. It's a lot of work. I mean, just transcribing a 2-hour interview is like, that's your morning right there. Yeah. That's your morning.
You allude to the idea that, this one's a little bit different because the vast majority of the players are still alive. What's it like to write the account of somebody else's life and then have them be able to see it?
It's anxiety inducing. It is really anxiety inducing. I ask other people what their impression of a person is. And I ask a lot of different people that same question. So if I'm, when I'm going to write about, Dent Thompson, for instance, or Mark Thompson, those are the 2 brothers who start this company. Everybody I interview who knows them, I ask, tell me about this person. What are they like? What's it like to be in a room with them? And there are certain outliers, but for the most part, people will give you a general, if I pooled all your friends, I'd have some sense of what you're like. So then I start talking to you, and I already have this sort of general sense of your personality and the things you will do, what you find funny, how easily you are to piss off, like your interests, all those sorts of things. But then I talk to you, and so I kind of know like what buttons to push or what questions to ask to sort of confirm that, or at least to get you to sort of maybe expound on some of those parts of your personality. And I find when you do that, what you get is a really good idea of someone, generally what they're like. And if you don't deviate from that, if you don't turn them into a caricature, if you don't use the outlier opinions, if you just sort of, because there's always going to be someone who's like, oh, that dude's a dick. If you don't, if you sort of discard the top and bottom 2% and focus on what's in the middle, or 10% or whatever, you get like a pretty good indicator of a person, especially when you've been talking to them and you have their deeds and actions to sort of back up what people are saying. If everybody says you're a hero and your actions suggest you're a coward, like, all right, so we don't depict you as a hero. But if you do all that what you will get is people coming back to you and going, actually, you know what, like pretty good. Like, or like their wives or husbands would be like, you actually, you know, you kind of like nailed their personality. Because, you know, because you're getting both how they view themselves and how the people closest to them view them. And then you're writing that in light of what they've done. I think if you follow that formula, although I'm always nervous when people read it, you'll find that you hit pretty close to the bone.
Mm-hmm. How do you manage the burden of historical accuracy while you're trying to tell a narrative, in terms of, like, obviously you're taking the information in from real life firsthand sources that are giving you information. They all have their own lens that shifts things slightly, but then you compile everything together and make sure that those various lenses don't at some point turn the story askew to one way or the other. Is there this is the completed work, you send it out to a couple players and then get their opinion to make sure that they feel like it's capturing it accurately? Or how do you make sure that that final product is true to life in a way that doesn't go askew based on somebody's individual narrative?
Definitely don't send people a draft. Any writers out there who are, sort of up and coming, don't send people a draft, because, you know, it's like my mother always used to say, never tell anyone what you're going to name a kid. Just tell them what you have named the kid, because if you give them the option, they'll give you their opinion. And then for the rest of that kid's life, everybody's going to know that they all hated his name. It's very similar with a book. Like when you have an option, when something doesn't yet exist, you have a different opinion of it than when it does exist. So people don't see anything till it's done. But if I interview somebody and they tell me one thing, I will call that person that they talked about or that was involved in that thing. And I'll say, hey, is this kind of how you remember it? And what you find a lot of times is that's not how people remember it. There's almost always 2 or 3 versions of a story. So now you're kind of going like, all right, which one feels like the most true version of this? How many people, if 5 people say this and one person is insistent it's this, I always go with the 5. Sometimes it's right down the middle. When the phone call comes into Phoenix Air about Ebola patients, there was like serious disagreement about when that happened. So then I have to decide, okay, whose point of view am I telling this particular moment through? Is it the person placing the call? Is it the person who will find out that a call was placed? Or is it the person receiving the call? And so in the book, I put it in a point of view of the person receiving the call. So ultimately, I put that in the timeline of his perspective. But it's never an easy thing, because people are always like, memory's a weird, and that's what you realize. Memory is a weird thing. And there are 2 people who are at the same thing, at the same place, at the same time, and they think it was in different cities, on different days, at different times. Like they remember it vastly differently in ways you would just never expect. That is always tricky. And so you kind of have to go with the majority opinion. But also, I think if you, again, like come back to, what is the story you're telling? What are the dramatic and important details? And if nobody can agree on anything, then what's the essence of what happened in that moment? And then I just sort of focus on that more than I do on like, this is the instant this happened. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. I wanted, with this book, I kind of wanted to have it broken up by days. So it was like Tuesday, Wednesday, because Ebola, if it's going to kill you, it's going to kill you within 10 days. By the time Phoenix Air gets involved in a rescue, the 2 patients are already several days into their 10-day window. So we could very easily lay it out. The problem is some of the action takes place in Africa. Some of the action takes place in the US. There's a 12-hour time difference. So there's automatically a discrepancy, and everybody remembers things differently. So really quickly, I was like, I can't do, like, I was confused, and I was the one laying it out. And I was like, no. Like the reader's going to get confused. Let's just shelve that. Ultimately, nobody cares if it's noon on Wednesday or 2:00 on Thursday. Let's just follow the narrative. And so there are times, and you just kind of have to go like, nobody can really agree on how this happened. So let's not put like a fine point on exactly where we are in a moment. Let's really describe more like why this moment's important.
Mm-hmm. Hey, gang, if you could do me a favor and just, give this thing a rating, maybe subscribe YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, giving those a rating and subscribing to it makes a huge difference. If you follow it on social media, make sure to share the posts, like it. It's a small thing for you to do, but it makes a huge difference in the progress of this show. So I really appreciate you. Thank you. This podcast is brought to you in part by Hikes Boots. You can tell a lot about a brand by the way they choose to advertise. And Hikes didn't ask me to do anything specific. What they did was they sent me 2 pairs of structural fire boots. They sent me their Fire Eagle Air and their Fire Eagle Extreme. One's a traditional pull-up boot and one is a lace-up boot. I was a little bit skeptical at first of the lace-up boot, but I've been wearing it, and you put them on, pull one little handle, it tightens kind of around your calf and around your foot. It's super comfortable. It's kind of specifically molded to your foot as you pull those strings. Super comfortable, super supportive. Feels like an athletic shoe, except for kind of more structured. And so I love them. If you want to find out more information, check it out at hikesusa.com. That's HAIXUSA.com, or check the show notes. Rigaku. Today's episode is brought to you by Rigaku Analytical Devices, who are the folks that have been perfecting the 1064 nanometer ramen longer than a lot of us have even been doing hazmat. And they just launched their 4th generation handheld analyzer, the Icon X. It's built specifically for the real world stuff hazmat teams encounter. We're talking about dirty powders, mixed materials, dyes, colors, all the things that make other instruments throw a tantrum. But the 1064 nanometer laser means reduced fluorescence. So you get fast, reliable chemical ID in under a minute instead of staring at a blank screen, wondering what went wrong. And this new platform isn't just an upgrade. It's a whole new toolbox. It supports new accessories, including standoff analysis, so you can get the answers without getting too close. If you want an analyzer that's been evolving right alongside the hazmat world, check out Rigaku's newest ramen at rigakuanalytical.com, or check the show notes. Back to the show. So you can get to it there a little bit as, this is a complicated story with a lot of players. How do you visualize that or compile that in order to start to structure a narrative? Do you have like a murder board with photographs and strings, and or how do you manage that so that obviously the story is linear, but there's a lot of overlaying factors like you kind of alluded to? How do you lay that out so that you can visualize it or tell the tale?
This is like a Liam Neeson moment. I have a very specific set of skills. I suck at math, dude. Like, I think I got the lowest possible math score I could have gotten on my SAT. The one thing that I have this weird ability to look at a pile of pieces and know how they fit together. My son, when he was a kid, he was huge on Thomas the Train. And he had this big bag of like wooden train parts, and he would dump them on the floor. And I could just sort of look at the pieces and just know, like, okay, if we do this, and this, we'll ultimately have whatever shape it was he needed without having pieces left over or without running out of pieces. I don't know why things make sense to me, but when I look at a pile of pieces, I can just see where they fit together or how they fit together. Sometimes you get to the end and you go, I'll bet you it would be better if we moved. And so, you can shift things around, but I don't know, like maybe my horribleness at math is compensated by like my sort of storytelling instincts. I don't know. But it's just it's a thing that makes sense to me. And so as I begin, as people are telling me the story, like in my head, it just sort of like those red strings that are connecting all the murder victims, and it just sort of appears in my head, like I'm like Charlie Day and It's Always Sunny. Like I'm that, like my mind is that meme.
How did your experience working in emergency medicine flavor your perspective as you navigated the story?
It allows me to know where the important bits are. Anybody who's ever treated a patient knows what it's like to walk into a room and have, a patient who's dying. Like, even if you're not panicking, like there is anxiety in that moment. Like, that's the nature of the whole thing. It's just like, it isn't that you don't panic. It's that you're able to like press it all down and keep going. So I knew, when talking to doctors in Africa, doctors in the US, nurses, wherever, like, hey, in this particular moment, I'll bet you that really sucked. Or how did you feel when this happened? So like to a degree, it helped me to sort of pinpoint my signposts. And then also when somebody says, yeah, we jumped in the airplane and, I started an IV. Like anyone who's ever started an IV knows, like, it's a pretty simple process, but there is like a weird voice in the back of your head that's going, hey man, don't get stuck with this needle. What if that patient has Ebola and you're wearing 2 pairs of gloves and a pair of goggles and you're sweating and you can't see and you can't feel and you can't hear? That feels like a really complicated thing to do. Oh, and you're doing it with the patient who has one of the most infectious and one of the scariest diseases known to man. I'll bet you that was a really heightened moment, wasn't it? Oh God, you have no idea. I've done thousands of IVs, but that one freaked me out. It provides you a window into at least maybe where the big moments were. And then also the ability to understand when they say, we had to do this, knowing what this is and what this feels like. Because really that's what when you're trying to tell a story, you want your listener to know how it felt to be sitting there. Like you're not just telling like this happened and this happened and this happened. What you're saying is like, in this moment, this guy had this thing going on around him, and all he wanted to do was that. And when you understand how it feels to be in those moments, it helps you to really get into it.
So the next question is in that same mindset of like using your perspective to gain their perspective. The one thing that I kept coming back to while reading this book was like, I think that at surface level, it's easy to say like, oh, there's kind of this altruistic, like, oh, we want to help thing. But like, as it boils down, what do you think some of the truest motivations for these people were to do this? Like, is like the thing that kept coming back to me is like, good God, they must have been paying them so much money. Right. Or I mean, I don't know whether that's true or not, or it's like maybe these are just like, Mother Teresa people that are willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. But it's like they're putting themselves out there pretty far. So what do you, after all the conversations and compiling all this information, what do you really think was the motivations of these people to do this?
I mean, some of the people involved were volunteers. So like, that motive begins to go out the window. Anyone who's ever worked in healthcare knows, like, unless you're an orthopedic surgeon, brother, they're not paying you a lot of money. You're making good money, but you're not making flying to the apocalypse money. Not since the Halliburton days in the mid 2000s anyway. So, you take money off the table and then it becomes, okay, so you can practice medicine in a lot of different ways. What is it that's making you want to practice this particular type of medicine, which I think really gets down to it. I mean, yes, there is I'm here to help and I'm driven by a sense of service. I think that exists in all these people, volunteers and paid alike. But I also think that there's something in people who want to be involved in that, like anyone, scale it back for a second, like going to EMS, there are certain people, or the fire service, there's certain people who, are cool being in a quiet suburban or rural fire department and love it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But there are people who want to be in a busy city who are like, I want to be on hazmat team. I want to be high angle rescue. I want to be, I want to do the tactical stuff. There's a critical care transport team. Like I want to be there. Like the people who, you said your wife works both ER and ICU. Like, she could work in the floor, man. Like, like not to insult anybody on the floor, but like, it's kind of easier on the floor, like life is quieter. Like, what is she doing there? Why is she, like running into the two most difficult specialties in that hospital? It's because like, she wants that challenge. She's driven by, knowing like, I can do it. I have done it. I will do it. Like that is, peculiar kind of drug. And so I think that's a lot of it for these guys. As much as anyone will tell you, I have a sense of service. I feel drawn and driven to provide medical care to people who absolutely aren't going to get it. There is 1000%, that like little twinge in the back of the brain that just like needs that sort of needs those stakes, needs that kind of environment, and it drives them to very specifically to look out for those things. So I do think, I hesitate to say things like thrill seeker or adventure seeker, because I think that puts a negative spin on it. I'm not sure that's how they see themselves, but there's definitely, there are easier ways to provide medical care than, being in the middle of an Ebola outbreak or flying around the world into crazy hotspots. Why do you do that? There is some party that's like, man, like, what's the most extreme version of this? And let's go do that.
Yeah. And I mean, truthfully, as I'm getting through the book, and like they start talking about Phoenix Air, which is the air service, and like some of the things that Phoenix did, I was like, Kevin could make a career of just writing Phoenix Air stories, I feel like, right? It's like, it's crazy as they go down the list. You're like, my God, they did that and they did this. And, they started out transporting high explosives. And then they were doing, being a target for the Navy. And it's like, what on earth is these guys doing? So I think that it would be, it would sell them short to not call at least the pilots thrill seekers, because it's pretty unbelievable what they're willing to do in a plane. Then they go and seek out specialized Gulf streams that are the only ones in the world that can, it's like, what on earth, just so that they can do these missions that nobody else can do. And then, yeah, unbelievable. Well, the other thing, how shocking was it? I don't want to give away too much, because I really do want people to read the book, because it's so good. But there's a portion of the book where they talk about them preparing and gathering PPE to go and do, to go finally go do this mission. And they're literally going to like Home Depot to buy things. As you learned this stuff, as you're doing these interviews, are you not just like jaw agape that this is the process in which we're doing? Like, what was that like to hear that from a firsthand perspective? And you're just like, what the hell are you, that's how I felt reading that. I can't imagine talking to them.
I was excited, like those are the moments I was like, hell yes. Cause that's a detail that you can't make up. If you made that up, people would be like, not true. Yeah. So when they say that, I was like, hell yes. Because what a great, but if you've worked in emergency medicine, are you surprised? Like anyone who went through the pandemic, like you'd show up, and I love, there was at every, EMS service, whatever, there's always like, or hospital, heroes work here banner over the door. And then those same people are showing up and they're like, hey, I hope you saved your N95 from yesterday because we're out and we don't have any more.
Yeah.
So you're getting screwed. So like, was I surprised that the people being asked, not supported by our government, but being sort of like tacitly approved to do this by our government, like the president himself was involved in these guys can pull this off, even though the president was like, nope, I'm not going to provide you with the military, but y'all can go ahead and do it. No surprise that they would show up the next morning to figure out how do we do this and realize like, oh, we don't have nearly enough PPE to make this thing happen. Like no surprise one bit. And anyone who's ever worked this job is like so used to being the butt of the cosmic joke that you read that and like some part of you is like, yeah, of course they had to go to Home Depot. Of course there weren't enough gowns and there's not enough Tyvek and there's not enough goggles on planet Earth to get you through this.
Yeah, I in my brain, I love this moment that could have theoretically happened while they were checking out at Home Depot and the cash register attendant was trying to make conversation like, oh, home improvement project. And they're like, actually Ebola, right? He's like, what the hell? So the story that's being told here, right? You obviously made the decision from like, wow, this is really a shocking thing. And you roll out the red carpet of all these interviews and figure out everything. Like now looking back retrospectively, what are you most proud that you were able to capture inside of the book?
I think the feeling that the people who did it had as they were entering into this, that's kind of like, I struggled with the title for this one. I wrestled with it for quite a while. I couldn't come up because like the obvious answer is like something like Air Ebola or something, which is catchy and cool, by the way. That was my original title. But then I was like, I don't know, like, what does that really mean? And does it say anything larger about the story? And the answer was kind of no. So I was going back and forth about what is this specifically about? What is this book really about? And in all the interviews, what I kept coming across, I mean, you just brought it up with the Home Depot thing. Like, these are like situations in which, the providers are out on a limb by themselves. The patients were in a bad situation, and the world was saying, literally, there were people saying, like, sucks to be you, but I guess you're just going to have to die there. Nobody wanted this rescue to happen. They had to will this thing into existence against like fierce resistance from a lot of different sides. So like the patients were looking around going, is anybody going to save us? And the providers were looking around going, is anybody going to support us? And, the answer to that, generally speaking, was no. But, what do you see in the very middle of this? You see a lone healthcare worker stepping into like the most dangerous and horrifying chasm that we can possibly imagine, quite literally the apocalypse, to save a life, to save someone they don't know. And so to be able to capture the feeling that everybody had, that everybody who like strapped on a set of PPE and came into contact with Ebola for a human being they did not know, quite literally risked their lives and their families' lives for someone that they had never met and other than this one transport wouldn't meet, to capture like why you do that and how you do that and the pride that somebody takes in going, this is maybe the worst idea I've ever had, but it's worth it because when it's all over with, I will have saved a life. If I can do this right, like that is such a remarkable thing. And like we all love superhero movies, but like nobody flies, man. Like nobody's trying to save the galaxy. You know what I mean? Like that's just not a thing. Yeah. But like, so like, okay, so what's a real hero actually look like? Well, I mean, it's someone who like risks their lives for other people. And, that is what all these guys were doing. Every man, every woman who stepped into this situation knowingly, like was well aware of the risks to themselves, to the people they love, to everybody around them, and just said, this is the right thing to do. And so I'm going to do it. But then on top of that to say, and I can do it right. I know how to do this. I know how to do this safely. I will save this person's life. I will not kill myself. I will not kill my family and my neighbors. Like I'll pull this off. Like super impressive. So that to me was the most important thing to capture, was that sense of what's going through your mind when you step into this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Could you have ever fathomed starting years ago in this process, finally releasing this book, that we would be facing a new Ebola outbreak in the world? Like what an insane thing. We were talking a little bit before we kind of started formally here, but yeah, unbelievable that a book, capturing the 2014 Ebola outbreak comes out, and now look, we're sitting at a 2026 Ebola outbreak. Unbelievable.
So let me tell you, back up. So in 2022, I released American Sirens, which is about, first paramedics. And what they were up against was just like this huge denial of the medicine that they were providing. And part of, the research for that story led me to 19th century England when this cholera outbreak erupts. People did not really know what cholera was in the early 1800s. And, it's like raging across the city of London. It was the first time that hospitals sent workers out in a little carriage to pick people up and to bring them to the hospital, not because they thought they could treat the cholera, but they knew if we get them away from the population, at least we can stop this. So it was the first like ambulance or hospital-borne ambulance system to treat patients. And people on the ground in London were like, there's no such thing as cholera. This is a fake thing. They're not treating your family. They're not quarantining your family. They're actually doing this thing called burking, which is they're bringing them to the hospital and they're stealing your organs. In the mid 1960s, you have people trying to bring the paramedic to the world. And you have like this, like we've all heard of the white paper. We know that, preventable traumatic deaths were an epidemic in the United States in the mid 60s. And you have people trying to fix that. And there are people going, no, you can't practice medicine in an ambulance. You can't practice medicine in the street. Only doctors can practice medicine. So that story 130 years later is still alive. I'm writing it during the pandemic in which people are saying, no, COVID's not real. And I'm not going to wear a mask because there's no, like a mask does not stop airborne particulate in any kind of way, even though in 1980, if you had surgery, your surgeon would have worn a mask because that surgeon knew that like the mask will slow down the spread of airborne particulate and make you less likely to get sick. So we're watching that happen then. So I knew that like history repeats itself, and very specifically, anything that we don't understand, we have this tendency to build all these sort of myths around, which is why like myths and conspiracies exist in the first place. Because, the moment the mind doesn't have a concrete answer, it begins to devise its own. So I knew that, medicine in particular is not something people understand. And so when anything big happens, medically speaking, like all this craziness happens around it. So we knew that stuff was going to continue. And then, so I knew when I started to write this one that yes, it's about 2014, but really when you get down to it, like, what is it? Like Phoenix Air has the ability to transport these people because they had done a tremendous amount of preparation in the build up to this. They had created the ABCS, and they had people who were prepared to go in. And, there's people on the ground in Africa. Why are there people on the ground in Africa during the outbreak? Because there were organizations that realized that there was a big problem that we needed to be involved. So, so much of this was about preparation. And then also like what happens when you cut away that preparation, the Ebola treatment center or the highly infectious disease unit at Emory University Hospital, right before it goes into use to treat these patients, the CDC had cut funding for its lab, and so it was partially shut down. The EMS service that was going to transport these patients across the city had just shut down its critical transport team. And so it was just lucky that it happened to have two people who were trained to transport infectious diseases by ambulance. We are so short-sighted as an animal. We just have this tendency to like, once something's over, we're like, it's over and it's never going to come back. We don't need it, but like shutting down your highly infectious disease unit because you haven't used it yet is like canceling your life insurance because you're not dead yet. Like, no, I mean, it's there for a reason, and it's probably going to like be important at some point. So why not, have it? And so like, things are cyclical, things come back. We have a tendency as creatures into preparation because it just feels like a waste. And this was such a perfect example of like why preparation is important, why foresight is important, and why like what happened yesterday is coming today. Like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs is circling back. We probably ought to think about how we're going to handle it.
Mm-hmm. So as we look to kind of start wrapping up here, what's on the horizon? Is there a new story that's emerging in your midst?
I'm working on a couple different things. It's early days, so none of it really exists, officially yet. But yeah, I'm trying to, figure out what the next thing is going to be because there's so many. What you realize when you peel back any story is like every human being has something fascinating going on with them. Every moment has some angle that you have not yet looked at. So there's always incredible stories. So yeah, I'm kind of like digging around right now to figure out what the next thing is going to be. And then also I'm adapting both Sirens and No One's Coming. One's for a movie and one's for a television show. So I'm in the midst of doing that right now. So just, what
does that look like? Give me a view to that lens. How does someone, I understand the structure needs to change, but what does adopting a movie into one of these other mediums really look like? Not much more, about kind of what you would think. So, a book it gives you so much more freedom than a movie does. Like a movie script is so tight, and you may not realize it when you watch it, but like if you sit down and focus on a movie, like it is a watch. There's not an extraneous piece in that movie. Like everything is there for a reason. It is a really efficient sort of piece of entertainment. So what you've got to do is like, all right, what's the heart of this story? What is this thing really about? And who is the person that I'm going to put into that thing? Like, who's that person? What is it very specifically that they need? And how does this particular story challenge and ultimately bring out that need? So it requires you to distill something down to its very, very particular essence. And then, just like exploit that for as much fun and drama as you possibly can. from that point, once the script is created, then what happens? You have to then take that and bring that to production companies and try to like get someone to fund it, or how does that work?
So we got there's a production company on board for the American Sirens thing, and they funded writing the script. So that's cool. That's not always the case, but that's good on this one. So that's where we are. Once I'm done with that script, then we'll take that out to, then you begin going to like studios or the sort of producers that have like A24. I mean, I think we've all seen the A24 horror movies. They're a perfect example of a smaller sort of production house / studio that produces things. But there's also stuff like Universal or Warner Brothers, like giant, behemoth kind of things that produce. So you take it to them next, but this is a particularly weird time, like Hollywood is changing, like how things are being made is changing, what people are watching is changing, how they're watching it. So it's kind of a tricky time to try to get something done. But that's kind of, like you get something going and then you try to, like American Sirens, perfect example. Like if you're trying to make a movie right now, largely about like black guys, what are you going to do? Man, you're going to like run a path to Michael B. Jordan's house and say like, hey man, which I'm sure the whole world is doing. So like, that's like, 30 years ago, you'd have been like, hey, Denzel, hey, Denzel. So now, you're trying to build, always you're just trying to build like, what are the heaviest hitting pieces that we can put together that make this undeniable.
Mm-hmm. So as I let you go here, let the people know where they can find out more information about No One's Coming, where they can find the other books.
Yeah. So, I have a website, kevinhazzard.com, although, I haven't updated that one yet. It doesn't have No One's Coming on it, but I'm on Instagram, which I guess that automatically puts me on Facebook. And, so I post a lot of stuff on there, like any stuff I have going on, things about the book. I try to put in like side stories that people, that weren't able to be included and people that were involved and all this sort of stuff. So there's stuff in there. But yeah, if you just look me up on any of those platforms, you'll find me. And but the book is available literally anywhere you get them, any bookstore. There it is. A badass cover right there, man.
It looks good. Well, thanks, Kevin. It was great to meet you. I can't oversell how much I enjoyed the book. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for talking about it with me. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. It's so good to be here, man. I appreciate it. We've been trying to get this one going for a while, so it's nice.
Exactly. So maybe, who knows, we get one of these TV shows or a movie made, we'll have you back. We'll talk about that too.
Right on, man.
Perfect. Thanks, Kev.